Thank you very much, everyone. Do you know what one of my favorite things is about coming to Copenhagen? Copenhagen, Denmark, and Odense? It's I get to try one of these, the Kanelschneiler. Now, hands up who is partial or who even can pronounce this sweet Danish treat. It's a few people. Cinnamony, it's delicious. But imagine going to the bakery for your sweet breakfast fix and being told, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait. We need to source the ingredients. We need to knead the dough. We've not even fired those ovens up yet. And they do this over and over again for each customer that comes in. It would be frustrating and just a tad wasteful, I'm sure you'll agree. Now let's compare this to how often we serve websites to our customers. The user comes along and just wants the content, that sweet HTML and CSS. But instead of being provided it straight back, the server goes, just give me a second while I speak to some databases, some APIs, and maybe some more servers thrown into the mix before it eventually returns back with the content and goes through the same process over and over again. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam, and today we're going to look at a different way of building and serving websites as we look at static site generation and how we can embrace the principle of bake, don't fry. Pre-baking our content as static HTML instead of dynamically frying up requests each time they come in. So what are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to spotlight a specific static site generation tool called Astro. We'll look at how we can get up and running with Astro from a basic Hello World type example all the way through to integrating the content delivery API for a CMS-powered static site. We'll also touch upon some hosting options and look at how we can keep our content fresh when our editors are busy publishing. So firstly, what on earth is Astro? Well, it's a meta framework which was created by Fred K. Schott and Nate Moore and a team of open source engineers that saw an opportunity really to rethink how meta frameworks and static site generators are built. Now, its core focus is on content-driven sites. So on one end of the spectrum, that could be simple blogs, the things maybe we associate with static site generation. But also on the other side could be big marketing sites, brochureware sites, the sort of sites we often build with Umbraco, which makes Astro, in my opinion, a perfect headless partner for Umbraco. It's also fully open source, has a rich community dedicated to documentation, pull requests, and the developer experience, which will sound very familiar to all of us here as part of the Umbraco community. Its key differentiation is it serves zero JavaScript down to the browser by default, and that's what gives it a superpower in terms of fast performance. So we're now going to enter our Astro bakery today and bake a really basic example of Astro first, a Hello World type example, to understand the syntax and understand how it works, and then we'll later make that a bit more advanced. So firstly, with Astro, how can we install it? The installation process could not be much simpler for a developer anyway. All we have to do is run npm create astro at latest. That will install everything we need on disk, all of our dependencies to get up and running in no time. Now, some key directories that it will create and we will be working with are these: pages, layouts, and components. So pages is where it will store all of our page files for Astro, and we'll see how that works shortly. The pages directory has a bit of a superpower, which I'll elaborate on shortly. Layouts, and that's where we'll store all of our common HTML. The HTML will be reused by the pages elements. And then components, we can think of this a little bit like partials or view components from the world of .NET and Umbraco. So remember, I mentioned before, the pages directory has a superpower, and that's because it is responsible for the routing of the Astro application. So if we create pages in here, for example, an index page, that will have a corresponding effect on the root. So the index page will resolve to the root URL. Creating more files and directories in here will have a corresponding effect on the URL structure for the site. A blog directory with an index in it will resolve to /blog, and then the article files themselves will have an impact on the URL structure. Now we're going to put a pin in the routing for now, and we're going to return to it shortly and advance it slightly. So I'll leave that there for now. And what we're going to do is open up one of those files, so that index file, to understand some of the syntax of Astro and how it works. So firstly, within this file, we're going to import a layout from our common layouts area. We're then going to use that defined layout and output some basic HTML. This is a hello world type example, or hello Astro. The reason I've kept it so simple is I want to call out this area at the top there. Now this is known in the world of Astro as the component script, and uses the triple dash code fence to segment the script from the markup. Now within that component script, you can put any JavaScript you want, or will ultimately be used to generate the static file on a build. For those of you who think that might look familiar, if you've used Markdown in the past, it's very similar to the concept of front matter in look. It's very different in how it works, but that is where the Astro team got their inspiration for that. So that's a basic hello world type example, but it's an Umbraco conference, so we want to bring another ingredient to the table here, and it's not salt, it is the Content Delivery API. Now, if you've not used the Content Delivery API before, it was introduced into version 12 of the core product and brings headless functionality natively to the core product. It's a really rich API. You know, you can imagine all of the content it returns on a request, all of your properties and all of that data. Lots comes back from it. It's got many endpoints and many different ways of querying it. For advanced ways of using it, I will refer you to the fantastic documentation that there is online for it. And we're going to keep it fairly simple today to keep the touch points, excuse me, touch points between Astro and Umbraco simple. So we're going to look at two types of API endpoints today. There's a base URL, which will be used for both of those, which is /Umbraco, /delivery, /API, and then the version is currently on version 2. Then two types of API endpoint, which we'll go through and show in the examples today. One to get a single item back, and that is /content, /item, and then you provide a path. Now the path would be similar to passing a URL on in a browser. If no path is provided, we would get the root node, in many situations the home node. And then an endpoint for returning a collection of items, known as the query endpoint, with /content. And there's many different ways of using this, and we'll see how we can utilize it in the examples coming forward now. So let's look at folding Umbraco into our mixture and make this, this bake CMS-powered. So let's go back to our index file that we had before and start working on what we've got already. So remember the component script at the start there? We can put any JavaScript we want in there. So we're going to do a fetch request directly in that component script to the Content Delivery API to get a single item back. Notice in the code there, there's no path, so that would, in this example, get the home page. Once we've got our response coming back there as well, we can get the JSON data and apply that to a property. So the property is called page there. What we can do then is use that page property directly within the markup below. So it's that simple to get that integration up and running. Here's an example of outputting a title, potentially a subtitle. And here is an example of some rich text content and how we can output that. So if the content's already HTML, we can use the directive in Astro, which is set HTML, to output that like so. Now, we're going to return back to the routing here. So remember, the pages directory is responsible for routing for the application. So this is an index file, the home page. Websites often have more than one page, right? So if we were to take this approach for everything, we'd have to create an Astro file for every single route, and that's not sustainable or advisable at all. So instead of this syntax, we're not going to call our file that. We're going to switch it to this strange yet elegant syntax. Now, in the world of Astro, this is known as a multi-level dynamic route. And there's two things I want to point out here which are important. Firstly is the triple dot there. Now, this signifies that it's a multi-level route. If they weren't there, it would be a single level dynamic route and would just operate across one URL depth. This gives it depth in terms of setting URLs. There's reasons to use a single route, but in this example, we want Umbraco to manage all of the URL setting. Then the name of the file. I've called it path here. Now this is actually a convention. So whatever you name the file here will set by convention the name of a parameter that you will set in the file. I'll show you how to do that shortly. In many examples of Astro, you'll see slug, URL. I prefer path, but it's a preference thing, so it can be whatever you want. So that, in a way, defers all URL routing or URL setting to Umbraco, which is what we want. So let's now open our multi-level dynamic route. So within our component script at the start now, we're going to make use of a special function, which we can utilize in here, called getStaticPaths. So getStaticPaths expects us to return a collection of items which should set the URL for the page and also pass the page data for it to ultimately render in the markup. So how can we do that? So within getStaticPaths, we're going to do a fetch request to the content delivery API, this time to get a collection of items back. This particular endpoint is paginated, and there's different queries you can add onto it using a skip-take pagination, excuse me. Here I'm taking 100, just to keep it really simple for this example. In reality, you would want to handle that in a robust way in a production application. We can then get the JSON data back, apply that to a variable, and this will be a collection, an array. So we need to iterate across that using the JavaScript map function, and we want to do two things here. We want to set the URL for the page and also pass it some data for it to render. So firstly, we can set the URL like this. So this is where the convention comes in. We've named the file path, and now we're going to set a parameter called path and set it to page.root.path, which in the content delivery API is where the URL is stored. Now, we also want to pass it some data to render. Here, I'm actually going to pass it the whole page object to a model property. I want as much data as possible to render in here. Underneath getStaticPaths, then, we're going to deconstruct the Astro properties to get access to that, and then we can output it within the markup area. Now, you're probably thinking, well, this is across many pages, and not all of my pages have the same properties or the same layout, so how can we manage that? So we can still use the dynamic route as our entry level for the application, but instead of outputting the properties directly, let's get rid of that. We want some sort of strategy to interrogate the content type and do something with that. So here we're going to check what the content type is. If it's of type homepage, render a homepage component. So it's a component, the homepage, not a page. So it's going to live within the components directory under potentially a pages subdirectory. We don't want it in the pages directory because that will affect the routing. We don't want to monkey around with that. So then we can extend this for a simple application. Maybe there's a general page, which is something really simple. Component page for block grid, block list, that sort of thing. Then extend our strategy like so to render the correct component for the given content type. So remember I said before that the content delivery API returns lots of data. You can imagine a really rich Umbraco application. You're getting lots back from your JSON there. And as developers, do we really want to be picking through Swagger requests and Postman to try and work out what everything's called? That is guaranteed to blow your mind. So how can we have a more organized bakery and make our developers more happy? So for that, when working with Astro and the content delivery API, we can use TypeScript. So for those of you who aren't familiar with TypeScript, essentially it adds a layer on top of JavaScript to bring strongly typed behavior to JavaScript. It's actually set up by default in Astro, so there's no more configuration to do, which is great. The two key things from a very high level point of view, it catches errors at build time as opposed to runtime. Ideally on the developer's machine instead of some environment, so it should be cheaper and easier to fix, easier. IntelliSense, though, is what I'm getting at here. It will make it much easier to work with that content that's coming, that data that's coming back from a system that's not connected. So we can interrogate that data within the IDE, within the editor, rather than having Postman or Swagger opening somewhere, so we can get the spellings right, mainly. So this should overall improve the developer experience. Say improve the developer experience. That's until you realize I'm now going to have to manage type definitions for every possible thing that could come back from Umbraco. And speaking from experience, that's a nightmare and would be, going forward, hard to maintain. So what if there were a way we could point our machine at some sort of specification and get it to generate all of the types on disk for us? A little bit like Models Builder, but for TypeScript. And it turns out we can do just that. So for that, we'll leverage the specification, which is Swagger. For those of you not familiar with Swagger, again, essentially it adds it's a way of documenting the features and functionalities of an API, most importantly in a way that's readable by humans and also by machines. So Swagger, what we can do here is a human, and as humans, we can visit /umbraco/swagger in the back office, and there get an understanding of what the API is, its features, its functionality, its documentation. You've probably all used it, but if you haven't, go and explore that. And as a machine, we can point it at the JSON representation of this and get it to do stuff. Now, I'll move on to how we do that shortly. But first of all, there's a problem. And that's because the current version of Umbraco does not have a fully fleshed out specification for any custom content types, custom data types. But, and I know they're in the audience, the community to the rescue here. So a big shout out to Laura and Vitor for creating, yes, clap if you want. For creating this fantastic and essential package as it stands for doing this sort of stuff called the Delivery API extensions. Now this does two things. Firstly, it introduces a content app into the back office for us to be able to explore the responses for the content delivery API on a given item. But more importantly here, it fleshes out that open API specification, Swagger, with a fully realized spec of all of the custom content type, custom data type. So now we can point the thing at it to generate the types. But what is that thing? Well, it's an NPM package. And there's many NPM packages out there that can do this. And the one I'm going to recommend here is Hey API at OpenAPI-TS. Reliably informed, that's the one that's used in-house at Umbraco. I'm looking at a few Umbraco people here. Once that's installed, we can then create a script in our package JSON, for instance, generate, and that can hit the installed module, give it an input, which is the URL to the Swagger JSON, and then an output, which is a directory on disk for it to render the types to. And not only does it render the types, so we've created essentially a models builder, but for TypeScript, it will also create us, helpfully, some services, so we can now use these as opposed to fetch requests within Astro. So we get IntelliSense and error checking, even on the requests to the delivery API too, so that's super helpful. So all this really empowers developers to build more complex things more robustly and hopefully more efficiently. Let's look at how we could potentially implement a really simple block grid, which on the surface may seem like quite a daunting thing to do in Astro. You may think it might take a while, but it's really quite simple. Now we've got TypeScript set up, we get all of the IntelliSense, and we can more easily and more confidently work through that. So what we're going to do this time is we've got our component page within our page's subdirectory of components, and then we can have a blocks area, which could potentially have a block grid Astro file, which can act as the block grid renderer, and then a suite of blocks. In this simple example, rich text, image, quote. In reality, the list would most likely go on. What we can do then is, within our multi-level route, we're going to check to see if the content type is component page. If it is, render the component page component. Then within this, you'll see something slightly different now. So we're going to now import some types from our generated TypeScript. So we're importing the type here, component page content, from the generated place on disk. We're then going to create an interface, which is going to tell it that the model coming in is of type component page content. We're then going to import our block grid renderer, deconstruct, and then within the markup below, we can then call our block grid element and then pass it a grid parameter and then pass it model.properties.grid. In reality, that would have IntelliSense on it, so we wouldn't have to try and find out what the property is called. It's called grid, it would be more obvious. Then within our block grid itself, you see this is starting to get a little bit more advanced. So we're importing some more generated types here. Again, these would be a pain to manually have to create. Again, speaking from experience. Import a suite of blocks. Interface to tell it that the grid parameter coming in is of type API block grid model. Deconstruct, so we get access to that grid property. I'm going to shimmy that up. And then this is a really basic sort of component map. So what I want to do is check what the content type is of that block and then render the given block. Create a wrapper for the grid. And this is just using some simple Tailwind classes in this instance. Other frameworks are available. And then iterate over the blocks that come back. And then check what the content type is. And then render the given block for that. So a super simple block grid, but it shows you can get up and running quite fast with this. And what you can do then is in each block, you can use the IntelliSense, interrogate the column span, and add in the correct Tailwind class for that. You can get a nice simple grid up and running very quickly. Bellissima. No, not that one. I got a laugh, I don't know. So now we'd have our static files being built for us by Astro. So they're static files. So where can we host them? Now, because it is just static files, the components of the web, the elements of the web, they can live on any old server, really. But we will advise you explore the many cloud hosting offerings there are out there. Now, one good one to start with is Vercel. So Vercel are actually the official hosting provider for Astro. It's a really fully featured hosting offering. So I really recommend exploring them. Netlify as well have an Astro offering too, probably a direct competitor to Vercel, but also worth looking at. Cloudflare Pages. I've actually personally not used Cloudflare Pages with Astro, but I know members of the community in this probably very room have success with that. So that's another recommended thing to look at. And for those of you who potentially want the familiarity of Azure, or you have Azure very much baked into your DevOps and your company, then Azure Static Web Apps is a fantastic way to host Astro applications. I've hosted Astro applications in that, but I will say you don't get anywhere near the amount out of the box than you do with the others. You have to bring all of the rebuilding to the table yourself using GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines, but in many dev scenarios, that might be a preference too, but it's definitely worth exploring that. So how, now we've got a static site built, can we keep our content oven fresh when our editors are busy saving and publishing and clicking that big green button or small green button? For that, we can use webhooks. And for those of you not familiar with webhooks, essentially it allows two systems that aren't connected to be able to communicate with each other via events over HTTP. And we're really spoiled these days because webhooks is available out of the box with Umbraco, so there's no more real configuration to do here. We can just browse to the settings section, down to webhooks in the tree, and there we can create a webhook, and we want to do something when content has changed. So let's create a webhook when content has been published, unpublished, or deleted. More events are available. We'll keep it simple here. Now here I'm going to trigger a redeploy and a rebuild with Vercel. You change that to however you're actually hosting the application. Now there's one thing to note that's really important to discuss for any static site generation here, which is build times. Now when someone clicks publish, it does not instantly appear on the website. That's a caveat of using static site generation. Now there are things you can do to speed this up. Astro, as making that choice to use that, it's one of the fastest at doing static site generation. Also has a beta feature at the moment called incremental rebuilds. It's currently in beta, but does attempt to speed that up dramatically, but there's still a delay, and I think that needs to be accepted if you're taking this approach to hosting a website. Now, build times, that's one area. The other area to look at is published volume. So it may be that you have a very busy back office, lots of editors, some days when they're all publishing left, right, and center, and it's important to know that in the simple setup, one of those will trigger a rebuild on some server somewhere. So if it's a very busy back office, think about sustainability, because you don't want to be using loads of services externally to the application to do rebuilds if that's why you're choosing Astro. And also you create bottlenecks, race conditions, all sorts of things can go on. So if you've got a really busy back office, potentially static site generations is not the right approach, and there's other ways of serving sites, even with Astro, to look at as well. So we're slowly going to bring this to a close today in our Astro bakery. So I just wanted to give a quick recap of what we've covered. So we've looked at Astro, how we can get up and running from that very simple, basic hello world type example, all the way through to bringing in the content delivery API for a CMS-powered static site. We've looked at TypeScript, how we can auto-generate the types on disk and really improve the developer experience, especially when working with an API which is separate to the application we're working within. It really improves it and makes it more robust way of building stuff. We've touched upon hosting options as well, and looked at how we can keep our content fresh when our editors are busy publishing. Now, I've been using Astro for about 12 months now. Previously for that, I was using Gatsby, and I moved to Astro, and I can honestly say that I find it a really intuitive experience, and in my opinion, as it stands, makes a perfect headless partner for Umbraco, helping us embrace the principle of bake, don't fry. Before I close, I just wanted to thank many members of the community, most of them in this room, I think. Astro is, when I first tabled this talk for Codegarden, I was like, here's a novel thing that no one would have thought about before. Not only had there been a talk which I was not aware of before that, this last 12 months has been really busy in the community, lots of blogs, lots of other talks on the whole thing, and Laura and Vito's package and all of that. So I do feel like, in a way, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here with giving this talk today. I've rewritten it a handful of times off the back of some blogs that have come out. And a massive shout out to an individual, Richard, who's sat there, for spearheading and I'm going to use the phrase spearheading the idea to try and get Umbraco featured in the Astro documentation. And it was a really nice community effort that happened quite fast, actually. We had to sort of dive into the Astro way of working and see how we can collaborate with their documentation. And myself and Rick helped Richard get this moving, and we actually managed to become live on the Astro documentation about 4 weeks ago, I think it was. So it was a really nice community effort, and to see us on there. And it'll also grow as well. It's a really simple example that's on there at the moment, but we're going to look at to grow that somewhat. And it's also nice to see Umbraco featured externally on something that's very widely used, and see it alongside some other CMSs in there. So it's been a very busy day in the bakery today. It has been busy, yes. So busy, in fact, that we do have some Knellschneilers available for anyone who would like a sweet treat before dinner. So please go in. They're at the front. They're at the front. And I do have the cookie cutter as well somewhere, but I'm not sure how that's going to work with those. But yeah, so thanks for all for coming along, and it's amazing to see so many of you as well. Adam Prendergast, Technical Director at Absurd Digital. Most days you'll find me floating around on Discord as Prenders. Come and say hello. On X, Twitter, Up and Adam. So thank you very much indeed.